Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Lipovetsky, and I'm professor at Columbia University. And today is our probably next or maybe last in this season event at the Harriman Institute. Today we will have the reading of the new translation of Pushkin's famous little tragedy, Feast During the Plague, by Matvey Inkilevich. Matvey Inkilevich, of course, is the translator of this very famous and very beloved text, which certainly is having today uh, much higher urgency than it might have had a year ago. And it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce to those who don't know, although I doubt that there are many people in this virtual audience who doesn't know Matvey Yankilevich, our today's speaker and guest. Matvey Yankilevich, who is uh, famous, I'm not afraid of this word, both as the translator, poet, and editor, and I'm very happy that we are also colleagues since Matvey also teaches at Columbia University at the School of Arts. He teaches translation and book arts there. Many of you probably know fabulous book by Daniel Harms. Today I wrote nothing. The selected writings of Daniel Harms that Matvey almost single-handedly, I guess, if not totally single-handedly translated and prepared for the publication and introduced, and which became now the classical book that we use in every class where Harms is being taught. He also is a co-translator with Evgeny Ostashevsky of Alexander Vidensky's book of poetry, An Invitation for Me to Think, published by New York Review of Books Poets, which received a National Translation Award. He has been awarded very prestigious fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts for Translation and the New York Foundation for the Arts for his poetry, as well as National Endowment for Humanities Fellowship for a forthcoming translation of Osip Mandelstam's Voronezh Notebooks. And I hope we'll have presentation when it comes out. Maxim, what I'm saying, Matvey, I'm sorry. Matvey, I'm sorry. Because it's maximal, right? That's why I'm saying. Matvey is also an original poet, author of several books of poetry. Um, and his latest book of poetry, Some Worlds for Dr. Vogt. He is also the founding member of the Ugly Duckling Press editorial collective and has created this press's Eastern European Poets series since 2002. And many of us know and enjoy this series because it published very important translations from Russian and East European poetry. And this press actually made a great change on the market of poets from this region and introduced many of them to the Anglophonic readers. So I think that I spoke too long, and I would rather leave the stage and leave it for Matvey, who will say a few words about uh, why and how it happened that he decided to do a new translation of Pushkin's plague during the feast during the plague. I'm sorry. Then he will do the reading, and after this we will have a Q&A session. Due to the format that we are using, due to the format of webinar, please use the chat or Q&A button to send questions in the written format. Um, uh, Carl Jackson and Alexandra Turek will be moderating this virtual conversation, and Matvey will be answering the questions that you will send. I'm pretty sure that we'll try to accommodate everyone. All right. Okay. So here is Matvey Inkilevich with Pushkin.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be in your company. And thank you for inviting me to present this translation to the virtual audience. Hello, everybody. Unfortunately, I can't see you, but I'm glad you're here. We'll just start by kind of giving some background to the Pushkin text itself. Of course, this text has, for most Russian speakers, readers of Russian literature, probably has come to mind in the last month. I actually, obviously, similarly to most Russians, remembered it and remembered particularly one of the central poems in it sometime in March. And then I recalled that I had actually worked on a translation of this text. So I recently polished it up and it was published online, but also I also made this during the first month of the kind of lockdown quarantine type thing. I also made this little booklet while I was, with some basic materials here at Ugly Duckling Press to revisit this text. And I'll say a little bit just about when Pushkin wrote it. It was 1830. He in that summer, in the late summer, he had traveled to Boldino, a town about 400 miles east of Moscow, to settle some business, coming into legal ownership of a family estate, which would complete the dowry that he needed to marry his betrothed, Natalia Goncharova. Due to an outbreak of cholera, which was not uncommon in those times, Pushkin was unable to return to the capital as soon as he thought, and the roads were blocked by quarantine checkpoints, and some of them closed by cordon sanitaire, what's called, so you couldn't leave certain areas. And then, so he ended up, after one failed attempt to go back to Moscow, he ended up staying in Boldino for 3 or 4 months, what turned out to be, and is often called in Russian literary legend, the Boldino Autumn, and during which he wrote the final chapters of Eugene Onegin and a number of prose works, Tales of Belkin, as well as these 4 short plays, verse plays, collectively known as the Little Tragedies, and one of those plays is The Feast During the Plague. Of course, it's sort of obvious once you know the context why he would have turned to this theme or this topic. He based the this short verse play on a very long, rather tedious romantic Scottish romantic drama called The City of the Plague, which had been published in England in 1816, and I believe it was published in Russia actually in translation potentially in just shortly in the 20s, so shortly before Pushkin wrote this text. Wilson, John Wilson, the author of City of the Plague, was a chair of moral philosophy at the University of Edinburgh and was a friend in his youth with poets such as William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and others. He was not a poet that we really go back to now, and in a way, Pushkin's translation of sorts of this play and kind of abridgment of this old play is a kind of free translation or imitation that has become, that has superseded its source. I translated this play originally for a production, for a operetta or cabaret style production by composer, a Russian emigre composer, Sergei Dreznin. I edited some of the translation while sitting with the composer at his piano in order to fit it into the metrics that were required by the songs, by the music, and sticking also to the Russian metrics to some degree, but also trying to make it sound right for the musical production. This play, the production itself was staged by Garek Chernyakhovsky, who was a legendary and very much beloved Moscow stage director and TV producer and host. He died, unfortunately, in 2015. So I'd like to dedicate this reading to him. It was only performed a few times, I think in New York once or twice, and I think in Vienna. And perhaps it will be performed again at some point. So I'll just say a few words about how I'm going to do the reading of the play. It should take about 20 minutes. There are characters. I'll name the characters. I'll read the remarks, the stage instructions, so that you can set the settings, so that you can see kind of what's happening. They're very brief. It's important to know that it begins with a toast at a feast table. One of the main characters is not the first speaker, but the main character is the chairman, otherwise known as Walsingham. And and you'll see that the chairman and also one of the other participants of the feast has a song in the midst of this play. So I won't sing those songs, but they are rhymed. So you'll hear them, and they're prefaced. Also that you should know that toward the end, a priest comes in, and there's a kind of dialogue between the priest and Walsingham. Walsingham's and the priest is obviously unhappy about this feast going on during the plague. So that's the general trajectory. So I don't want you to get lost. I will try to be clear when I'm switching roles, although I'm not an actor. So I hope you'll be able to follow along. Okay. Alexander Pushkin's Feast During the Plague. A street, a table set for festivities, several men and women feasting. Young man, most honorable chairman, let's remember a friend and colleague, a man we all knew well, he who by jest and witty storytelling, sharp observation, cutting repartees, so acid in their strange and solemn humor, enlightened our glum table conversation and chased away the dark which presently the plague, our uninvited guest, has cast upon our best and brightest, brilliant minds. 2 days ago, in unison, our laughter played to his stories. No, it cannot be that in our merry feasting we forget him. Old Jackson, that joker. Look now how empty his chair stands waiting, as if expecting him to return. But he is gone from here for colder parts, that underground estate. No tongue more eloquent has ever gone stone quiet in sepulchre's cold ashes. Yet we are many left alive, so there's no reason to be sorrowful. And now let's raise a toast in memory of Jackson. Let glasses ring and lift our voices higher as if he were alive. Chairman, he was the first to leave our friendly table, so let us drink to his honor in silence. Young man, be it so. All drink in silence. Chairman, your voice, my dear, brings forth with wild perfection the hidden beauty of your country's song. Sing, Mary, sing long laments of broken hearts, so we may turn to merriment more madly, as one who has been torn away by visions returns with passions to worldly matters. Mary, singing. Once upon a time, our village was so peaceful to behold. Every Sunday early morning, church was filled with young and old. Our children's happy voices from the noisy school sang sweet. Busy scythe and gleaming sickle flickered over fields of wheat. Now the church is still and empty, and the schoolhouse stands forlorn. Darkness falls upon the forest, and in vain stands ripe the corn. House and home are burned and blackened, village ruined on the hill. All is quiet, but the graveyard, seldom empty, never still. They cart corpses by the minute, and the groans of those who live call on God their sins to pardon and eternal rest to give. Every minute numbers growing, shovels work around the clock, and the graves they crowd together, lined up like a frightened flock. If my youthful spring is faded, destined to an early grave, you whom I have loved so dearly, you to whom my life I gave, stay away, I pray, from Jenny. To her corpse do not come near. You must never touch her dead lips. For your own life, pray, have fear. And then, after I am buried, go forget this ghostly town. Somewhere else you'll find another who will wear the wedding gown. When at last the plague is over, visit my poor dust, I pray. And in heaven, faithful Jenny will beside her Edmund stay. Chairman, our gratitude, dear melancholy Mary, deep thanks for this sad, plaintive threnody. In bygone days, a plague like ours seems to have visited your country's hills and valleys, and moaning, pitiful laments had sounded down brooks and streams along the shores of rivers, which now run peacefully and happy throughout your native land's wild paradise. That gloomy year when myriad had fallen, good-hearted, proud, pure, noble souls, that year's dark memory barely left a trace in some forgotten, simple shepherd's song, so mournful and so pleasing. No, there is naught that brings such sadness to our celebration as the pining sound that echoes in the heart. Mary, oh, had I never sung outside that cottage where I lived with my parents as a child. Oh, how they loved the voice of their dear Mary. I hear my own self singing in the old days before I stepped across my native threshold. My voice was sweeter in those days. It was the golden voice of innocence. Louisa, these ditties are out of fashion now. But even still, there are some simple spirits quick to soften at women's tears and blindly follow them. She seems quite confident her tear-filled glances men cannot resist. If she thought also a bit about her smile, I'd bet £1 she would be grinning. Poor Walsingham. He praises barking northern beauties. That's why she tries so hard to whimper. How I hate the shitty yellow of that Scottish hair. Chairman, shh, listen, I hear the clattering of wheels. A cart passes, filled with dead bodies. A black man drives it. Chairman, what now? Louisa's fainted, but judging by her tongue, you'd think she had a manly heart. You see, the cruel is weaker than the tender, and fear inhabits souls tortured by passions. Some water, Mary, on her face. She's better. Mary, rest now, dear sister, of my shame and sorrow. Recline upon my breast. Louisa, coming back to her senses. I had a vision, as dark as night, a white-eyed, horrid demon. He beckoned me into his wagon. There lay gruesome bodies, and they muttered, a speech unknown, so horrible, so strange. Please tell me now, was this a dream, a vision, or has a hearse passed by? Young man, come now, Louisa, come, lighten up, for this whole street is ours, a silent haven from the hands of death, a shelter for wild feasts that stop for no one. Yet, as you know, that one black wagon holds the right to travel wherever it may choose. Our duty is to let it pass. But listen, old Walsingham, to put an end to quarrels and female fainting's consequences, sing us a ballad, sing a free and lively ballad, and none of that tedious Scottish melancholy, a booming, thunderous bacchanalian song conceived with frothing chalice in your hand. Chairman, there's none I know, but I will sing a hymn to you in honor of our guest, the plague. Last night I wrote it after our parting. An appetite for rhymes assailed me strangely, First time in my whole life. Prick up your ears. My voice is hoarse, the better for the song. When great and mighty winter stirs, and like a chieftain wrapped in furs, upon us sends its shaggy soldiers of biting frost and stinging snow, it's met with fire's crackling smolder and wintry warmth of feasts aglow. Her terrible majesty, the plague, herself does now offensive take, rich harvests reaps herself to flatter. Upon our windows day and night, her graveyard shovel knocks and clatters. What can be done? How can we fight? As from the winter pest we hide, we'll also lock the plague outside. We'll fires light, we'll fill our chalice, and merrily our minds will drown, and brewing feasts and balls for solace will glorify the plague's new crown. There's rapture in a battle, bliss upon the brink of the abyss, and in the raging ocean's fury, midst angry waves and darkness vague, and in the desert whirlwinds hurry, and in the breeze that brings the plague. All that threatens us with death hides for the mortal in its depth an inexplicable enchantment, a promise of eternal life. He's lucky who in dire moments has tasted of these sweet delights. We sing your praise, long live the plague. We do not fear the darkest grave. We will not shy from your endeavor. We'll drink the maiden's rosy breath and clang our foaming cups together, and both are filled, perhaps, with death. Enter an old clergyman. Priest, what godless feast is this? What godless madmen? You with your feasting and your ribald singing throw insult on the gloomy silence which has now been spread by death in all directions. Amidst the horror of the mournful burials, I pray amidst pale faces at the graveyard, and meanwhile your detestable delight embarrasses the quiet of the graves and shakes the trembling earth above dead bodies. If not for prayers of aged men and youthful maidens that bless the common mortal pit, I would have thought these sounds to be of demons, tormenting some poor atheistic soul and dragging it into the pitch with laughter. Voices from the crowd. Does he not speak of hell with mastery? Begone, old man, get back to where you came from. Priest, now I beseech you by the sacred blood of he who has been crucified to save us, break up your monstrous feast if you sincerely do hope to meet in heaven up on high, beloved souls that you have lost on earth. Break up this feast, go to your homes. Chairman, our homes are filled with sorrow. Youth loves entertainment. Priest, can it be you, Walsingham, who just 3 weeks ago I witnessed kneeling, his mother's corpse clasped to his sobbing chest, and howling beat himself above her gravestone? Or do you think that now she is not weeping, not shedding bitter tears in that high heaven, from where she sees her only son reveling at a perverted feast, and hears your voice raised in mad, frantic song, pitched high amidst both holy prayer and sighing lamentations? Come, follow me. Chairman, why do you now come here thus to disturb me? No, I can't, I must not, I will not follow you. What keeps me here? These memories, this hopeless desperation, the knowledge of my lawless, evil ways. I'm kept here by the horror of my home that greets me with a silence dead and empty, the novelty of these wild entertainments, and by the loving poison of this chalice. Forgive me, Lord, I linger for her kiss, the love of this delightful ruined creature, nor could my mother's ghost call me from here. But it's too late. I hear your warning voice, the voice that calls me. I thank you for your efforts to save my soul. Now go in peace, believer, but damned to hell be he who follows you. Bravo, bravo, many speaking. Bravo, bravo, well-spoken, worthy chairman. You've got your sermon now. Be gone, be gone. Priest, Matilda's saintly spirit summons you. Chairman, rising. Swear to me now to leave it in the grave. Lift up your pale and withered hand and promise to never speak that heaven-silenced name. Oh, that a wall of darkness hid this sight from her immortal eyes. She, my beloved, once thought my spirit pure and proud and free, and my embrace was paradise to her. But now, oh, holy child of light, I see you there, where my far fallen soul can never hope to soar. A woman's voice. Look, he's a madman. He's talking to his wife, dead and buried. Priest. Come, come, my son. Chairman. For God's sake, Holy Father, leave me be. Priest. Almighty God, have mercy. Farewell, my son. He exits. The feast continues. The chairman remains sunken in deep thought. The end.
Thank you, Matvey. That was great. That was wonderful. I hope you can hear the storm of applause. So just imagine it. Okay, use your imagination. I'm opening the floor for Q&A and hope our audience, among which we see some very professional translators, will send their comments or questions. But so far, I would like, first of all, to say that I'm deeply impressed by this translation, and I understand that the idea of the exact translation or accurate translation is a phantom, and it's never works. But for some reason, you managed to be free and extremely accurate at the same time. And your translation of the Walsingham's hymn is amazing. I think
Thank you.
Just you hear Pushkin's text behind it, but at the same time it's extremely natural in English, and that's uncanny impression when you hear the same poetry in a different language. But I cannot help until you invited this, asking about the parallels between Wilson Pushkin's tragedy and our today's situation, and our today's situation that became even more dramatic or even more degrading. In comparison with the moment when you first posted or published this translation online, right? Certainly there is a tradition of reading this text, and especially Walsingham's hymn, as the glorification of some kind of existential freedom and even exaltation, liberational exaltation associated with the sense of mortality, right? And what we are seeing around us is a very great parallel to what Walsingham is singing about, I think. But you, in your introduction to translation, you're writing about hope in hopelessness, right? And you find this sensation at the bottom of Pushkin's text. So could you please speak a little bit more about this, maybe not only about Pushkin, but also about the station we are living through?
Yeah, it's not easy to, I don't really want to draw parallels that, maybe perhaps play down the seriousness of some of the actual issues at play in our current situation, which has so much to do with it's a much less existential situation we're in now, and a much more political one. In other words, you know, the plagues, or sorry, the COVID, the way that COVID has revealed structural inequalities in our country and elsewhere, and also problems in our leadership and so forth, systemic problems in our society, the effect on the poor, the disproportionate effect it has on people who are already vulnerable. Those are things that are not really discussed in Pushkin's play, which is a much, you know, more abstract kind of space. There is, in a way, some kind of perhaps existentialist or pre-existentialist idea of embracing mortality in some way, or celebrating the plague, because in the end, it's the only way to get over the kind of false hope of a religious sort of idea of an afterlife, or and to treat maybe more realistically the end of life, and that the plague in Pushkin's text brings out in some way a kind of desire to face death in its emptiness courageously, right? By living life in the moment, living life anyway, regardless of death. So, you know, and this is not, I certainly don't think that this is advice for us. I do think that underneath that, the thematic, the way that the play moves, there is some doubt, you know, and Walsingham at the end is sunken in deep thought. He's remembered his dead mother, his dead wife. He's told the priest to go away because he doesn't want him speaking their names. And he's staying because he wants to kiss this girl and drink this wine, and, you know, and try to steel himself against death. But that action of like preparing or attempting to have courage it's not, you know, it's all of the revelers, the feasters here are in this in-between space of attempting to confront the plague, but they're not, it doesn't mean that they've sort of gotten, you know, surpassed their own fear, their own doubt about the afterlife or its existence. They're still in this limbo, to my mind. They're attempting in some way to come to terms with it, but it's through, perhaps for some of them, through a kind of cynicism almost. But I think they're also sort of in this fear space that is obviously mixed with hope, right? Or is founded on some kind of hope. Oh, I can't hear you, Mark.
Where does the hope come from?
That maybe there is there something after death? You know, this is the problem of, and I wrote in my translator's note, a problem of the main character in the Seventh Seal, right? The meaninglessness of just death without nothing after, with nothing after. And for one of the characters in the Seventh Seal, death is the final release or final alleviation of all of the terrible things that are life, you know, all of the terrible things that she sees in life, the plague, the torture of a witch, and the burning of the witch at the stake, and all kinds of cruelties between people, and treachery, and she is relieved at death. And you know, that could be one kind of hope. Or the hope of perhaps going on or surviving is supposedly could be a kind of hope of getting over getting past the plague, like the village that is sort of forgotten in the song from the village, that clearly they had the plague. They remember it through this song, but life went on to some degree, or now there's no plague there now. That's kind of a potential, but I don't know. Maybe it's the wrong framing, and I would love to hear your thoughts.
I think it's a great framing, and the song remains, right? It doesn't matter whether they survive. The song remains. Probably that's another hope. But again, sort of continuing with this dangerous path of parallelism, I can't help noticing that our current situation is almost exactly opposite to this romantic allegory, right? So feastings were prohibited first, as we noticed, right? And but that's not most important thing. The most important probably is you write in your translator's note that the plague appears as sublime rather in Birken than in Kantian sense. Sublime is something that cannot be controlled and is definitely horrible, right? But our encounter with pandemic, for some reason, sort of killed this sense of sublime. It's very mundane. It's sort of invisible, as plague was, but even more so. And so this lockdown makes it sort of diluted in the everyday routine. But do you think that still this sense of sublime getting to us? Do you think that this sort of almost 3 months of estrangement they do produce something similar to the effect of Pushkin's little tragedy?
I think so, and I think maybe nowadays we might express some of that in certain kinds of actual psychological effects of 3 months in solitary. Or I have met people that really just went out on the street for the first time like a week ago, but then I think also this situation has brought forth a kind of acknowledgement of a larger societal crisis that has fed into the current protests, and also the sort of sublime, you could call it the sublime lack of jobs, lack of food, this kind of situation of desperation is a kind of experience that makes possible perhaps a kind of manifestation of some kind of larger force, the people's will or whatever is rising up, right? That is maybe only possible in confrontation with something so beyond our grasp, so beyond our control. And that seems to be the sort of the rapture and bliss that Pushkin speaks about in Walsingham's famous song or hymn to the plague, is something that it creates a confrontation that is unlike any other in our human experience, and therefore it forces a certain it creates a liminal experience of one's own mortality, of society, of one's social environment as well, which becomes much more fragile and vulnerable in the context of this uncontrollable spreading disease that can affect anyone, and has affected people even when it hasn't directly infected them, right? So I do think that, you know, a lot of the energy behind the current protests has something to do with this experience, and with both with the experience of being kind of locked in for a few months, but also with the kind of trying to come to terms. And you know, these protests are, you know, I don't have much experience of them, but in my experience, you know, this is civil disobedience that is, you know, to my mind, perfectly, it is called for, and it has to do with just saying no to things like a curfew, you know, or impositions of rule, because because the moment of the experience of sublimity lets you helps you realize that those are just arbitrary rules, that somehow you're in touch with something new that is so powerful, that has maybe taken a relative or a friend, or has affected your community in some way, and also that has forced you to come to terms with your own mortality. And so you can do something like break curfew, you know.
Yeah, I agree with you. And indeed, this sense of sublimity, it's sort of transferred into something that people now compare with the revolution of 1968, the closest parallel ever, right? So it is indeed the transformation. But probably there are, we have a question from Marina Tyoмкina. Hello, Marina. Good to have you in the audience. Bravo, Matvey. It is interesting that the place of the play is the street. It is symbolic as a space between home and domesticity of life, family, mother, wife, and the other world. So how would you comment on that?
Yeah, the street. I mean, that struck me, of course, going back to the play after a long time. It struck me, this street, this idea of the feast in the street, and also that they have to let the cart go by. That is the rule. Like, the one rule is you let the cart with the bodies go by. It's a public space, and I think that in a way, Walsingham says that we don't want to go home. What is home? You know, home for us is devastation, despair. It's not the place we want to be. And I think that's part of what fuels people to be out on the street right now. Home is broken, and, you know, people talk about, you know, are we, you know, the usual narrative around, I mean, this hasn't been happening as much in New York, but the narrative around Minneapolis, that why are people, and the same thing happened during Ferguson, why are people burning down their own neighborhood? But actually, they don't own anything in that neighborhood, you know, so, and it's not their choice to be there necessarily. So it's not home, you know, it's a forced idea of home. But yeah, so there's no one for Walsingham to go back to, no wife, no mother. There's no domesticity. The plague has destroyed that. But I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, or if, because you're asking about the symbolic space, the street.
I think you answered it, and basically, okay. So the protest going to the street is indeed the answer, and it is the liminal space in a way, right? Yeah. Here's another question from Lil Nishma, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced some names. There seemed to be a certain humor at various points in the text, which I was not expecting, and this adds a broader range to the work. Can you talk more about the tone of the work and translating tone?
Well, there's a humorous kind of what in the old patriarchal times we might call a cat fight, you know, between Mary and Louisa. Louisa thinks that Mary is trying to get the attention of the chairman with a sad look, and so forth, and to charm, you know, that it's insincere, and she's angry, and then so there's this like altercation. And so there is some humor there. You know, you could also say there's some morbid humor throughout, in the sense that there's irony certainly in the hymn to the plague. You know, the idea that, you know, just like, you know, with the winter, when we light up fires, you know, we like, we meet winter with some kind of something that keeps us warm. And he says we'll lock the plague outside, but I don't, you know, it's interesting because it is in the street, right? So, but in the sense that they won't let it bother them, they'll keep feasting, right? And there are some ironic moments in the description of the plague in the hymn the chairman sings. Tonally, in terms of translating, that's a great question, Lindley. I mean, it also had to do with, you know, there's a kind of, you know, it's all speeches, right? So it's all toasts almost, and they're overly, you know, overly eloquent. They're long-winded. So there's a certain way of, I don't know, for me, it was about keeping that length of the period and trying to have this kind of high, elevated tonality that that in the context of the situation is kind of absurd, right? But maybe I'd have to think more about your question. Certainly the crowd is really not happy with the priest coming in and giving a serious sermon. They're really trying to push against that kind of spiritual rationality, you might say.
Thank you, Matvey. Here's another question from Olga Bukhina. Hello, Oля. Thank you, Matvey, says Olga Bukhina. A very general question. Is it a glorification of life that doesn't care about death, or a glorification of death that doesn't need life?
It's great. Great question. Thank you, Olga. I'm not sure that life is really that glorified here. I mean, it's
they're drinking and apparently having sex.
Yeah,
we can guess.
It's the way that they talk about it doesn't seem, you know, all that. It seems very forced to me. You know, like, yeah, he's going to stay at this feast because there's nowhere to go, there's no home to go back to. He's going to, he wants the kiss, the drink, the merriment, but it's almost half-hearted in a way. Like, I don't see it being like a real, you know, they're trying to keep this appearance up to come up against the plague. But, you know, you see Louisa fainting at the sight of the carriage going by, the cart. And you see Walsingham at the end having a vision of his wife and kind of going mad. So they're still like involved in what's out there. They haven't been able to completely just rejoice. So this rejoicing is a kind of protest, you could say, but I don't think it's necessarily like I don't think Pushkin is glorifying one thing over the other. If anything, I think it's the sublimity of death that that makes that is the kind of the power, the force here. And I think the hymn is the most interesting part of the play, and has stuck with people. And most Russian readers, speakers, native speakers remember parts of that hymn. I remember it from childhood, and it sticks with you. That's the frightening part. So I don't know if glorification is necessarily Pushkin's motivation in this.
I like this idea that it is in this space in between life and death. Although Again, you mentioned that the childhood impression for me, it's one of the most erotically charged Pushkin's works, at least Pushkin's plays, comparable with the Stone Guest. So it is the orgy after all, right?
Yeah.
And it depends on the presentation how it will be, how cheerful it will be. And you, as you mentioned, sort of, it's a little bit worn off orgy, but it suggests that it has been going on for quite a while. Here's a question from Andrei, who asks, why, in your opinion, of course, this play is the least discussed from other маленькие трагедии, little tragedies. Why do you think that hasn't attracted more attention of Pushkin's? I wouldn't completely agree with this, actually. I think that from the little tragedies, it is one of the even most discussed, right, along with the Stone Guest and Mozart and Salieri. But what do you think?
I don't know all of the criticism, and I didn't want to necessarily, I was doing this for a musical production. I didn't want to think about it as a critical translation, which might be a little bit different. There are different kinds of scholarly translations that might include commentaries from, scholars that have worked on this piece or other little tragedies. But this isn't quite that kind of translation. I think of it as a translation that is about a public, getting the work to a public. I would say that if it is indeed less talked about in the scholarship of Pushkin, it is perhaps because it is one kind of short, very brief. It's shorter, I believe, than the Stone Guest, quite a bit shorter, and it's rather enigmatic. I mean, in a way, it says it's everything is on its sleeve, and yet kind of enigmatic. Like, what do you do with it? What are you going to do? Talk about religion? Talk about? I mean, it would be really interesting to hear why Pushkin puts a black man as the driver of the cart. The race question in this play is strangely, it explodes kind of out of this play once you put it into a translation in an American context. It's a very odd choice, perhaps, but maybe not for Pushkin's time, even though Pushkin is a part of African heritage. But why race is important? It's just important in the early 19th century, I think, as a race and blackness as a kind of related to this sublime and often in a sort of aligning it with a sort of malevolent forces, right? The idea of blackness coming out of Kant or whatever, and Fred Moten writes about this. So you could think about that in this context. But that could be interesting to hear from a scholar about. But I don't know what else you would talk about. Why would you belabor this play with thinking about it in relationship to, you could talk about it in relationship to Pushkin's belief systems, how much Pushkin was a believer, which I don't know that he was more than socially, but to a great degree, but judging from some of his letters, but.
Thank you. Another short question from Olga Bukhina. It is one of the first things a child in Russia reads about death. Yes? Would you agree with this?
It what? Sorry?
Is it one of the first things a child in Russia reads about death? One of the first... I think that Kolobok is the first thing that we read about death. And it's much more tragic, I would say. At least here nobody dies.
Gingerbread man?
Yeah, a gingerbread man. So would you agree? No?
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose this is something, I didn't go to Soviet school, And I don't know what Russian schools are like now, post-Soviet. And I think we assume they're similar, but they're not, I don't think. And so it's hard to say what a younger generation would experience with this text.
Here is a very serious question from Alexander Skidan. Sasha, привет. Great translation, amazingly accurate. Thanks, Matvey. Yet, in the chairman's song, the last stanza, in the line "Will drink the maiden's rosy breath," I can't help but point out that "Девы розы пьем дыхание" in the original is something very different from rather romantic like "Maiden's rosy breath." Maiden rose is a rose, is something what comes to my non-English speaker's mind first, even if you should keep the rhythm here too. Could you please comment a bit on your decision here?
Let me see if I can find it.
Professionals in the audience is a dangerous crowd.
Yeah, I know. И девы розы пьем дыхание, быть может, полное чумы. Девы розы is hyphenated. And my interpretation was, you could, the maiden rose would be too much of a rose, but maybe that would be a nice correction. We drink, yeah, it's just hard with the rhythm, but for the song, because it was sung in this, in Dresnian's musical production, so it would have been a little bit difficult. But И девы розы пьем дыхание, it's the breath that we drink, which is the same, I think, in my translation. We drink the breath, but of what? Is it the maiden's breath or the smell of the rose? But here with the hyphen, I would say it's both. And it's Dieva Rosa, you could also, I think, argue that Dieva Rosa is a rose-like maiden. But Sasha, I appreciate your precision.
I would agree with you reading that it can be both, and probably that's the beauty of it, that it can be both a rose and a maiden. Right.
Maybe, yeah, it could be rose-like breath, or, I mean, I did want to cast it in a somewhat romantic idiom, English romantic idiom. So that was a choice to maybe even have some cliche, which I did, because I think it's important to say this is cliche, and it can be in English in cliches.
Thank you. One more question from Dmitry Broitman. Thank you, Matvey, for the translation, the reading, and the possibility to dive into Pushkin's poem again. I would disagree with the notion that Pushkin's Feast is a translation of sorts, with the exception of two intermissions, two songs, one of which became one of the most famous Russian poems in its own right. Pushkin's text is actually a very close translation, line by line, of abridged Wilson's Scene 4. What is a justification of translation Feast text? Songs are exceptions, of course, back from Russian when we have the original.
That's a good question. I started reading Wilson's tragedy and The City of the Plague. And to be honest, I didn't get very far. It's pretty tedious. And I just, for the purpose of the musical production, Dresnin wanted a translation of the Pushkin. To go back to the original, you could say there's an original, but this is a new original, I think. And to treat Pushkin's text as simply a translation that we don't need, that we could do without because it exists in the original language, is, I think, to misconstrue the way that translation poses the issue of what an original is and whether the original is the original. I think it's important to think about translation as something that displaces the original to a certain degree, or sets up questions about its originality. Is Wilson's work original? Is that is Pushkin text simply because it's an accurate translation of some of the aspects? Does that mean that it is not its own original? So these are questions that I'm interested in. I'm not saying definitively, but I think that it's something that a lot of people don't take into account when thinking of translation as a kind of, this serves a Russian audience and the English language text serves the English audience. It has gone through some kind of transformation in the sound, in the et cetera, and in culturally as a cultural artifact, it is its own work with a very long reception history, right? So I think it would be a mistake to just call it a translation. It is a translation in a way, but in the sense that I'm thinking of a new work in Russian. But I appreciate what you're saying, Dmitry. One could do that, and I think one could do that as a kind of hybrid form, or one could just not read the Pushkin and just read the Wilson, but I have a feeling you wouldn't have as much of an interesting time, but that's my opinion.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much. And basically in support to what you said about translation as a form of displacement, which produces new meaning by every new translation, Andrei sends us a commentary. That image of funeral car transferred directly from John Wilson's play. What is interesting is how Mary's song attracted attention of Russian poets in the 1910s, when Brusov organized the competition for the best poetic interpretation of it, which is another version of the same displacement, because of course it was done in the same language as Pushkin's, right?
That's a great point. Yeah.
So that's how poetry lives, probably, and even every new recitation and every new interpretation produces this minor displacement. But of course, translation is a major displacement, and that what remains. I'm looking at our list of questions, and I can see that there is none. But and you've worked a lot, so I'd rather wrap it up saying once again thank you so very much for this wonderful work and for this wonderful reading and for your great answers to questions. And I hope that we'll have some other attentions, maybe not only virtually, occasions to give you the floor with poetry and your own and in translation. And thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you everyone who came to this event.